Okay, today we're going to start chapter 14, lesson 2, the spread of Islam. So if you remember last time we talked about Muhammad and how he made the Islamic State, right? And he died around 632 AD. So he left no instructions about who should be the next leader of Islam. And remember, he was a prophet. He had a really big position. And so they needed someone who was really strong to keep the new Islamic State together. There was some disagreement on this, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the first four leaders after him, what they did is they had some of the leaders meet and choose who the leader should be. And so a caliph was a successor. That's what it literally means. And it was one of his friends, Abu Bakr, who was the first one. So the first four are all either close friends or relatives of Muhammad, okay? And their goal is to protect the empire that they've started, right? And to make spread Islam even farther, okay? So they're going to, use their military to do that. And so you do see the spreading happening, right, into Southwest Asia and Northeastern Africa. And so for, if about 100 years later, you've gotten quite a pretty large and powerful empire going, okay? During that time, right, so it starts becoming the Arab Empire, since most of the conquerors were from Arabia, right? They were Arabs. So it starts being called the Arab Empire. After the first four, then a new group governed the Arab Empire, and they were called the Umayyads. And they actually decided to change, and the city of Damascus became where they ruled from, and Damascus is in Syria, if you're not sure. And so this group governs from 661 to 750, and they expand even more, even farther into Asia and Africa. And so they have a really, large, powerful empire under them. And let's see, so remember that they're fighting, but they believe it's for like a religious cause, right? So they thought it's like their duty to spread Islam farther. So the other thing is, as they're conquering, remember some of the places they're conquering, like, for instance, the Byzantines or the Persians, where they had, like, forced people to, follow their official religion. And, a lot of those places, the people were pretty mistreated, right, if you wanted to have your own religion. So when the Muslims come in, many of the people they conquered weren't actually too sorry to see the other people go, right? And so the Arabs usually let the conquered people practice their own religions. Remember that Islam believes that, like Christians and Jews especially, right, they call them the people of the book, meaning they believe a lot of the same beliefs, the one God, and the sacred writings in the beginning, like Abraham, they believed was also a prophet, right? And so they believe in a lot of the same things, and so they were like acceptable, right? And so they respected them and their practices, and gave them more freedom. So it wasn't so as hard kind of for them to conquer and take over. And so then you see many of those people eventually over time actually become Muslims, right? So their language and their religion does spread. And of course, then they're also going to learn the language of Islam, which was the Arab language, right? So you see the spread of both of those. And then, of course, customs, too, are also going to spread as the empire gets larger, okay? So over time, when you start hearing Arab, you start to think of that as an Arab being someone who speaks Arabic, not necessarily someone who lives in Arabia, right? Because the Arab Empire has grown outside of Arabia. And so that's kind of a change in terminology over time. Okay. Also, I want to talk about Spain. I don't know if you realize this, but there's a lot of Islamic influence in Spain. And the reason for that is because, remember, these Muslim warriors are trying to expand, and they go into Spain remember, they went to northern Africa. So, right, Africa and Spain are actually quite close, right? And so they bring their religion and customs and traditions into Spain. And so you do see a lot of that influence. The city of Cordoba especially became a big center for Islamic learning. A lot of the big thinkers, and many of them were Islamic. The book goes into detail and tells you the names and everything. I don't think we need to go into that much detail, but there are some very famous writers, thinkers, and so they are going to be working closely, these Islamic thinkers, with the Christians and the Jews. And in some places, they even allowed them to kind of like study together, which is pretty, thinking out of the box and being pretty open-minded, very tolerant. And so there's a lot of schools and learning and kind of mixing of ideas in Spain at this time, especially Cordoba. The Jewish community did really well there. And so we see some translating from Arabic into Latin, and that's going to help those ideas spread into Europe, right? So anyway, I just wanted you to understand that. That's why you'll see a lot of Islamic, like artifacts and architecture and things in Spain, okay? All right. Also, so far we've been talking mostly about Islam spreading because of soldiers, right? And trying to make an empire and spread the religion that way. And that is, of course, very true. The other thing is there are two other groups that helped it spread also. One, where there was a group of preachers called Sufis. And Sufis were purposely going out and trying to like convert, right, followers to Islam. And then merchants, of course, we talked about this like in every civilization, right? Merchants, as they are going around and trading, of course, they're not just trading objects, they're also going to be sharing ideas. And so as we see this huge trade network developing, and I showed you some of the trade routes right there in that map image, and so they're crossing the Sahara and Africa, and you're going to see a big extension of ideas because they're following with the trade route, okay? So a lot of the religion is spread in these ways as well. I put that picture there of Timbuktu. That is one of the Western African cities that was really big because of trade, but also then, of course, becomes this major center of Muslim learning, and a lot of Muslims live there, and a lot of culture spreading is happening there. So you might have heard of Timbuktu, mostly because people say it like it's really far, like that's what it's become colloquially to mean, right? Like, but anyway, so I thought, you might have heard of it. Okay. So I had mentioned earlier that there's going to be a conflict, and the conflict was over who was the rightful successor after Muhammad. Okay. And so what happens is basically two different groups, are disagreeing about this, and they come to be known as the Sunnis and the Shia. Okay, so the Sunni, and this is still a division that's happening today. Okay, so I put there the Sunni. Let me start with the Shia. The Shia believed that the descendants had to be people directly from Muhammad. Okay, so like for instance, they thought Ali, that his son-in-law, was the rightful heir, and they thought all the future caliphs had to be his descendants from Ali. They remember I had told you that the Umayyads had taken over. The Shia do not believe that that was right. They did not think that that shift away from the family was acceptable. And they thought they were not the rightful rulers. And they also didn't agree with some of their decisions. So that's where the major division starts happening. And the Sunni, of course, do think that how they did it with the Umayyads taking over was fine, right? And so they kind of split off. Now, what's important to remember is originally, right, they're not disagreeing on the religion at all. They are believing exactly in the same religion and everything. It's just they're disagreeing on who should be the one to take over and rule. And so they divide, and it's still a major source of contention today. So the majority are Sunni. Depending on where you are, right, in some places there can be a majority. So for instance, in Iran and Iraq, they have the majority is the Shia. But in general, like the most Muslims are Sunni. Okay, and so by the way, I put in there, sometimes you hear the people who are part of the Shia, they're called Shiites. Okay, so I put both of those words there so if you see them, you will understand that they're talking about the same people, right? Okay. So their major principles of the religion are the same. They both believe there's the one God, and the Quran is the holy book, and the 5 pillars and all that stuff. It's just the, differences. And then, eventually over time, as you're, dividing yourselves, then they did start to like make some different customs and practices. So there are some slight differences now, but overall, right, the religion is still generally the same. Okay. All right. And then, so I'm going to show you a video on those because actually that can be quite contentious between the Sunni and the Shia. So I have a video for you. All right, so let's go on for now. So we're in about the 700s, if you're keeping track in your head of where we are in history. We last left off with the Umayyads, right? The Umayyads started getting not very popular, right? Non-Arab Muslims were angry because they felt like Arab Muslims had, which was true, the best jobs, and they got to pay lower taxes. And so there's a lot of discontent from the people that were not the Arab Muslims. So people who were Mesopotamian or Persian, right? Those empires that had been taken over. And those areas, by the way, are where Shia was more popular too. So they're the minority is feeling it, right? So about 750 or so, the Shia Muslims rebel, and they get some support from other Muslims throughout the empire who are feeling similarly, and they end up overthrowing the Umayyads. And so this is the new dynasty that comes to power, the Abbasids, okay? And so the Abbasids are going to rule until about 1258, all right? So in the meantime, they make their capital Baghdad. So you see a change in capital city. Of course, Baghdad has a great location along the Tigris River. And so the trade routes are going to connect with like the Mediterranean area, right? And so Baghdad is going to become a very beautiful, prosperous city. And so it's during this Abbasid period that the Arab Empire, has what they call a golden age, which we've talked about before, right? Culture is really appreciated. So especially Persians, they really liked Persian culture. So you see a lot of Persian influences during this time in the architecture and things like that. Okay, so we've talked about golden ages before. All right, and then just like everyone, eventually the Bassids start to lose their empire. It's hard to keep a big empire together, right? Over time, some of the territories start breaking apart. Like, for instance, in Egypt and Spain, they started like doing their own thing and setting up their own caliphs. And then some rivals took over in Persia. And so they start breaking off the edges of the empire, right? Start breaking off. And so pretty soon, by around the 1000s, they don't have a very big empire left. They have just around Baghdad left, okay? So it's around that time that the Seljuk Turks take over, okay? So they become coming in. The Seljuk Turks are nomads. They're really good warriors. They seize Baghdad in 1055, and they take over and they control the government and the army, but they do allow the caliphs to continue to be like the religious leaders in the area. Okay, so that's an interesting change that the Seljuk Turks do. They're in control for sure, right? They're going to run the government and everything. But they kind of let, hand in hand, they let the caliphs still be in control of the religion. And so they're kind of working together, okay? The Seljuk Turks, the leader is called a sultan, which literally means holder of power, okay? And for about 200 years, that's how it works, with the Seljuk Sultan being controlling the government, and then the Abbasid caliphs still there, but they're just doing, the religion. But then, of course, in about 1200s or so, the Mongols come in, and just like, right, John Green in A Crash Course is always so excited to talk about the Mongols. They sweep in, and of course they storm and take over Baghdad, and they burn all the buildings, and they kill a lot of people. Like, I'm sorry, shouldn't be laughing, like 50,000 people, right? So that's why John Green gets all about like the Mongols. And so very fierce attacks, and that pretty much brings the end of the Arab Empire. Okay. Then we need to go on to about the 1200s and the Ottoman Turks. So that it's a Turkish clan. It's from about Asia Minor. So they called themselves the Ottoman Turks after their leader Osman. And they conquered the Byzantine Empire. And then in 1453, another ruler called Mehmet II. He was called the Conqueror, known as the Conqueror. He seizes the capital, Constantinople, and this is when that city is renamed Istanbul. So remember in that song about Constantinople or Istanbul? So this is in the song they're talking about how, they keep changing the name. And then remember they said, I don't know, you'll have to ask the Turks. So here is this part about the Turks come in and conquer and rename Istanbul. They name it Istanbul instead of Constantinople. Okay. So they push in, they start taking over, they control. By about the 1500s or so, they are in control of, the whole Mediterranean region, basically. Okay. So the leader is called a sultan, like the Seljuk Turks had. Okay. And so Suleiman is one of the main rulers we should talk about. Suleiman is the first, by the way, Suleiman the First. He ruled during the 1500s. He was called the lawgiver. They like these little titles, don't they? Because, like, literally, he organized their laws, okay? And he did a lot to build more schools and mosques. So he's known for, helping improve the region. It also is a very large empire. So again, they're going to have people with different religions in their empire. And the Ottomans also chose to, Islam was the official religion, but and they let the Muslims have like special privileges, but they did let other people practice their own religion. So it wasn't like they made it, you have to be in our religion. Although you did have to pay, for example, a special tax to let you practice your religion freely. So that's an interesting way to deal with it. And of course, so Suleiman was great, but then eventually, right, things start breaking down after him, and the Europeans start coming in and taking some of these lands, and some of the, people start breaking away on the edges, same kind of thing, and their empire crumbles, but not for a while, in about the 1900s, so pretty long. Okay. All right, and then we have the Safavids. So in about 1500, a Shia leader named Ishmael, he said he was going to be the leader, and he was called a Shah, which is a king, basically, of Persia. Okay, so we're in that Persian area. So he starts his own dynasty. Ishmael is called the Safawi dynasty, and it rules Persia until about he's in the 1700s. That's all you really need to know. I'm not on an exact. And he spreads, right, the culture and the trade. Urdu is the language that's spoken still in Pakistan today, and it's partly based on the Persian original language. Okay, so again, trying to show you why things are kind of end up how they do nowadays. All right, and then we need to talk about India. So the Mughal Empire, and it's going to be a little confusing for sometimes kids get a hard time, right? We talked about the Mongols earlier. This is different, okay? The Mughals, look at the spelling. There's no N, right? So during the 1500s, the Mughals were setting up a Muslim empire in India, and Akbar was the leader there. He allowed people to practice their own religion, but after him, the leaders were not as good, and they were less tolerant, and they start persecuting the different religions. We've talked about Hindus before. We haven't talked about Sikhs yet. Sikhism is actually like the 5th largest religion. It's pretty large. I don't feel like I hear very many Americans know as much about Sikhism, but it's similar, and it's the one God and stressing good deeds. And they're the people that they don't cut their hair, right? The men let their hair go really long, and they put it up and they wear a turban. Okay, so I don't know if you know that, but that's something you might have heard. So they were heavily persecuted, unfortunately. And then about the 1600s or so, they rebel, right? They've had enough of that persecution. So the Sikhs and the Hindus rebel against the Mughals. And at the same time, you're having Europeans come, and they start arriving in India. And eventually, as you know, right, the Mughals are going to lose control, and eventually the British are going to take over in India, which I'm sure you are aware of.